Hey everyone, it's Last Protagonist. I wanted to share my thoughts today on the current state of Path of Exile 2 as of patch 0.3.1. I've actually had a lot of fun this patch. I've been really enjoying the campaign and the additions to the content in the endgame that it's brought overall with the maps, the monsters, the abyss functions, and whatnot. And due to the changes to the support gems and crafting, it makes it feel as though a lot more builds can come online or do things that they couldn't do beforehand. Now, with that being said, of course, there's still a bunch of skills which are not very good, and they will still need future iteration to improve them. That's just kind of par for the course. So, for example, companions still really suck as far as dealing damage is concerned. I don't really know if they're going to address that. Maybe that'll be a druid thing. It's a little bit disappointing, especially since they said that they were rebalancing virtually everything to be a bit more viable on its own. Definitely doesn't feel like that. It feels like Rapid Shot is almost completely gutted. I don't really know what good it is now with the cooldown that it has. But anyway, I'm getting a bit too far off topic. One of the other things which is really nice about this patch is the changes to the weapon swapping system that has really made the fluidity of moving between different build archetypes just that much better. So for instance, like right now I have two crossbows on. The one that I'm using right now is for my AoE clear, gives me onslaughts when I kill a bunch of things. And then when I'm doing single target damage, I have another crossbow that just pumps up my shock burst rounds. And that was a lot clunkier to pull off before this patch, although it was still possible. So moving on from that, I think the passive tree changes are nice, but still not quite enough to facilitate a lot of different things that players might want to accomplish in their different branches of the tree. It does still feel very homogenized where you are. So for instance, if you are trying to stack energy shield, you kind of want to be on the left side of the tree. I can't play and talk at the same time, apparently. Did I say left side of the tree? Yeah, you totally need to be on the right side of the tree. Otherwise, it's just going to be a little bit unoptimized. Dodge is bottom right. Evasion, deflect is all down there too. And of course, armor is on the left. And if you stray from those archetypes, you really have to put in a lot more effort to make it work, whether it be a bunch of extra traveling or perhaps using different types of jewels to get nodes from other parts of the tree. So that can be a little bit awkward. Otherwise, you're just more likely going to be playing something that's a little bit more off meta due to it being a little bit less viable as you scale things up compared to other builds. So let me look back at my notes here. Right. The end game is still the end game. There's really not much to talk about that because they said that they didn't really have the time and the resources to touch on the end game as much as they wanted to. So they were really focusing on putting out Act 4. And as far as all that's concerned, I appreciate GGG's forthcomingness with that type of information. And to me, this patch is kind of like a 9 out of 10. I legitimately don't know how a patch could be effectively better for this game in the future. I think this will probably be the best patch ever in terms of the actual quality of life adjustments that it brings in terms of adding in the trading function, the differences to crafting, the new robust skill gem support system. It's just absolutely staggering what we really have gotten. And for me, this has actually pushed Path of Exile 2 in another tier of enjoyment. Whereas when I was first reviewing it in point 1, I gave the game a 7 out of 10. I said it was good, but it still needed a lot of work and like a bunch of numerical tuning to get better to be a great game. I think for me it has hit that point now that I would be comfortable saying that Path of Exile 2 is an 8 out of 10, and that a lot of the things holding it back are still things that I brought up in my original critique, in that stats are a little bit confusing. The non-viability of the passive tree if you're trying to do a bunch of off-meta stuff, or just things that don't come super easily to your build and whatnot. Yeah, so anyway, the patch is super good. Some of the issues are going to be the same that I brought up. One of the things that didn't really surprise me, and I'll go ahead and say that I called it, was in my critique that because of the super heavily RNG based nature of the game, it's going to be extremely difficult for GGG to get high quality feedback for a lot of points in the game, more specifically the campaign, due to the RNG that is so prevalent throughout the game and gear. So, for example, if you manage to get some weapons with a plus skill gem level on them early on in the campaign, that could make you steamroll it, and therefore the campaign might feel a lot easier to you than it might be for other characters. This did happen to me this league. I wasn't really going to start with a crossbow, but when the bloated Miller literally dropped a +2 crossbow on my foray into this league, I guess that kind of was a foregone conclusion in me using crossbows this league, which I don't really regret. I've really been enjoying my build. And yeah, so I don't really know how they can realistically fix the RNG other than providing players so many crafting materials that they can craft their builds to the point where they will always have like 6 mods on their items very shortly into Act 1 and whatnot. And the reason why I say that, and I definitely understand why there'd be a knee-jerk reaction to say, like, no, that's kind of ridiculous. Why would you do that? The reason for it would be if we have such a huge disparity in the items of players as they progress through the acts, then how can you realistically begin to balance it so that way the game feels good for somebody who has, let's say, like a +3 skill level weapon that's kind of current and has like a decent amount of base DPS on the weapon versus somebody who doesn't have any skill levels and hasn't found a good upgrade for a while and might be a little bit lower in terms of their gear progression there. Or even things like movement speed can play a huge part in somebody's interactions with the campaign. So the reason why I think crafting would fix that would be it would kind of shorten the gap between those types of players. That's what I get. All right, let me look at my notes. Oh, yeah, so I don't want the crafting to necessarily remain the same as it is, and I think if they were to flatten so much of that kind of progression by making gear that abundant for players, they would need to probably add in a lot more tiers to kind of make the progression feel a little bit more smooth in terms of the curve between the early points of the campaign, the end of the campaign, the beginning of the end game, aka like early maps, white maps if you're a PoE 1 player, versus yellow maps and red maps and beyond. So right now, I think we've got a huge boost in our crafting upgrades due to things like essences. It's been a great addition to the league so far. Some people might think it's a little bit too powerful. I can understand why they would think that way, but I also think that for players who are just starting to dip their toes into crafting and updating their builds, it will actually give them a lot more agency in being able to... Oh, okay. Got the 2 Millers. It'll be enough to help them progress and adjust their build so that way they can kind of move from mid-endgame maps to late-endgame maps and the pinnacles as well. All right, what's my next point? Oh, yeah. So another really big discrepancy that happens throughout the campaign is for players who already know what their build is going to be, they have such a huge knowledge gap on newer players. They will be miles beyond absolute new players who have no idea what they're doing. So one way I think that could fix that would be allowing players to disenchant their skills and their support gems. So that way players who are new to the game can have the freedom to try different skills and different builds and find out what works best for them, as opposed to being locked into something that they don't really have any knowledge of, or even if they'll note that they'll like the tactile interactions between what skills they do have versus the ones that they don't. And that could also help if you want to change things later on, or you have a skill that's a higher level than another and you're not getting the upgrades that you need. That might help a bit. And we already kind of have that functionality on something like the Tame Beast skill gem as well as the Raised Spectre skill gem. So for me, that would just be kind of expanding a feature that's already in the game to improve it for players that it'll have a really big impact on, as opposed to being entirely negligible for the veterans who already know what they're going to do. So let's go back to my notes. Oh, yeah. So another thing is that the game, I think, as it's presented right now, still has a lot of issues in the way that the stats are presented to the players, especially with the way that certain weapons work. For instance, my crossbow currently has like added physical damage and elemental damage. However, it's a little bit unclear that the physical damage is local to the weapon and the elemental damage is global, which means the elemental damage gets like lumped in with the passive tree bonuses and things like that. So it's not as effective for scaling up your DPS as physical damages on the bow itself. And that is just kind of unintuitive as hell, especially if we go back to the whole issue with armor and deflection and stuff like that. Those are going to be a little bit hard to understand and kind of takes a lot of investment to make those truly worthwhile. So for instance, if I have an armor rating of 18%, I would intuitively expect to take 18% reduced damage from a physical hit, but that's not really what happens. Sorry, my dog is barking in his sleep. I don't know if that's coming through. And that is going to be a really huge thing for GGG to try to address. I don't realistically see them doing that. So I think it's just a little bit of a lost cause, but I would certainly appreciate if that was changed. And on that note, I do have a conspiracy theory tinfoil hat idea that the way that damage and stats are calculated might be leading to a lot of performance issues for players. And the reason why I've come to think this specifically is because I have noticed that the Soul Siphoner mod, when that shows up on Abyss enemies, my performance will go down pretty drastically, which, okay, that kind of sounds a little bit crazy when just taken in a vacuum, but I did manage to get a companion with the Soul Siphoner mod on, so I am able to replicate that when the Soul Siphoner mod is on and active, it will drastically take my FPS. So normally I'll have like 70 to 80 in a non-cluttered environment, maybe in the 30s if a lot's going on. But when I have the Soul Siphoner mod on and I'm going through the same content, I will literally drop down to single frames and it's just a terrible experience all around. And that might just be because the devs didn't really want players to have the Soul Siphoner mod and didn't really take that into expectation when they added it into the game. So whenever that hits a bunch of enemies, it just destroys frames. And I think the reason for that is the game has to do so many added calculations that it just kind of all falls apart. What is next? It's going to suck to try to do inventory management. Oh, yeah. So I don't know if this would actually fix things, but I've noticed that there's a really big disparity between the way that stats are allocated on the passive tree versus gear and equipment. The gear is just extremely powerful compared to the passive tree and whatnot. I was wondering if one way that this could be addressed would be having it so that flat damage, or like maybe not flat damage, but flat stats are just kind of used more frequently than added percents, because I think all these types of additive percentages just kind of really muddy the waters and makes things a lot more difficult to understand from a casual perspective, but it still might be a bit necessary in the long run there. So if we did have more increased percentages of things, maybe treat it more like the more modifier as opposed to increase. I know I'm not explaining this very well, so I apologize for that right now. Maybe flat damages would be, or flat statistics would be the better way to go, especially when dealing with the monsters, and that might keep the overall values in check. Because maybe it's a little bit too hard and too taxing on many rigs having to deal with dealing damage in the millions, and maybe a stat squish is kind of necessary. But of course, that is just an astronomically large change to make, and I don't really see that being the route GGG would want to take. So next, what did I have? I just saw it and I've already forgotten. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about trade. I did talk about crafting already. Trade, I've really enjoyed the changes to trade. I think it has made the overall experience much, much smoother for players, especially if they don't need to leave the client to interact with the trade. It does feel a little bit clunky in terms of the functionality of the search and not having a search history, or the way that things will not be saved if you go into somebody else's hideout to buy an item. So if you're trying to buy like a number of maps, you are kind of inclined to still use the external website to queue up the maps that you might want to buy if they're of a similar sort, or maybe base items if you're trying to craft things. So aside from that, I do have a little bit of mixed feelings on trading only being offered from Ange in Act 4. I think it might be good in the long run and help deter bots, so I'm not too upset about that. But it does feel a little bit awkward, at least in the beginning of the league, when you're trying to gear up a character, and if you're trying to buy something, whether it be a specific unique or perhaps a little bit of a better weapon, or maybe even a skill gem or a support gem, that you can't really do that until Act 4. Of course, there is the old trade system available, but it doesn't really seem like that's being used very much by people anymore, and it's just kind of AFK City, so best of luck. Maybe things will be a little bit different in the future. I don't know there. So as for the Act 4 stuff, I think that might just be the lesser of two evils, and I'm not too pressed about that. Oh yeah, so the current endgame changes that came with 3.1 specifically, I do have some mixed feelings about it. I don't like only looking at the mini-map and trying to find the rare icons that we had present before this recent patch. However, with that being said, I would almost prefer that we did get that specific change reverted with the icons, if no for no other reason than it is a little bit too difficult trying to differentiate rare mobs from non-rare mobs as you go across maps now. And of course there are some exceptions to that rules when enemies have like the Soul Siphoner mod on or the temporal bubble. But in general, things do feel a little bit more rippy, I'm assuming, especially if you're on hardcore, just because it's a lot more difficult to discern what the immediate threat is in your vicinity. So aside from that, one reason I did enjoy having the icons on the map is because it can be helpful if you are trying to tame beasts, which I know is a very fringe thing to do. But sometimes I'm dealing a little bit too much damage right now, and it'd be nice to know to hold back if I'm trying to discern if the mods on the monsters are ones that I might be interested in taming. Like this guy right here, at least I was able to tell he was rare because of the energy shield aura, but a lot of the mobs, I can't even tell they're rare until they drop some loot after the fact that they're dead. And that might be because I have a little bit of a faster build. I've cleared all the endgame content now, and it's not that big of a deal, but I am curious how things are going to feel for players gearing up now and starting to get into the maps, because I have noticed a large change in the tankiness of some of the bosses. Before, I was deleting them, and there was nothing they could really do against me. And now they're actually tanky. I do have some more time fighting them. I've discovered with some of the desecrated mobs that some of these bosses can end up becoming tankier than Uber Arbiter, especially if you're using the desecrated mob, which will allow the map boss to gain the souls of all the rare enemies, and you've been stacking rare enemies in that. Like get 23. I don't maybe Rock Yada's Flow can overwrite that. I don't have it, I don't use it. But it's definitely a nice change for people in like the juicing stage of the game. But I'm a little bit beyond the early parts of the map to truly know how these changes affect them. Now, moving on from that, I do really like the changes to the precursor tablets. I also kind of like the pseudo lore of being able to get the tablets from the towers themselves. So it does make towers feel a little bit extra special and a little bit more rewarding, especially early on in a league, I'm going to assume. So I think this will also facilitate a lot more agency over what kind of content you want to do, which is quite nice, as well as what maps you want to do that content on. And on the Passive Tree podcast with Miso Shiru, Dead Rabbit, and Cal Tarak, they brought up a good point that while the 3-tower setup might have been really good when we had it available, maybe that loot is just become averaged over a number of maps. So while the maps might feel a little bit less juiced overall, we might be getting a little bit more loot more consistently to kind of overcome that disparity there, which I think is a potentially good point, but we don't really have the math to know whether that's true or not. Forgot we had Delirium on the map. So as far as the endgame stuff goes, I really, really like the Abyss League. I really enjoy the loot that we're getting from the Abyss. Going into the Abyssal Depths, I think is really cool. However, one goofy thing that I've noticed after getting toward the very endgame progression and being able to really juice up the maps is that, ironically enough, a lot of the Abyssal Depths kind of don't scale in the end game, and they feel way easier than the map that you're running because the abyssal sections of the maps don't get modified at all, which just feels really backwards compared to the campaign. I don't know if they should change that or not, but it just was a little bit surprising, I guess. So I think the last thing that I still want to talk about with the state of Path of Exile 2 that I haven't touched on already is how much the endgame progression still sucks. The tower setup stuff will be nicer for sure. However, with that being said, when I was going through the league this time around, I was able to down tier 3 Zesht before I even cleared a tier 12 corrupted Nexus because of how ridiculously easy it is to gear with the trade league going on, and how annoying it is trying to find corrupted nexuses to cleanse to begin with. To be fair, I did goof up really early on, and I think I failed my very first corrupted nexus, so that did set me back slightly. But it's a little bit awkward being able to clear tier 15 corrupted maps way before you can get the points for clearing them. And the same thing goes for all of the Atlas passive tree nodes for the bosses. I was able to clear Uber Arbiter before I actually found the Citadel on my map. I guess we could show this off. It took me over 100 maps to find my first Citadel, and I was kind of going in mostly one direction. But to be fair, I was also trying to clear out some of the special maps, like the Mansion in the Mists. I thought I had one somewhere around there. Anyway, yeah. Other than trying to do some of the special maps, I wasn't really meandering. So, where's my home? Okay. So, I did kind of mess up by going down here first because I saw an Untainted Paradise and I wanted to level that up. And then I was getting the tower there. And so I doubled back this way. But it's just a huge time investment before I even found my first Citadel. And if I was able to down Uber Arbiter before even getting to that Citadel. That just does not feel good. And of course, this is beating a bit of a dead horse. Oh, here it is. This is beating a bit of a dead horse, and I know a lot of people have had issues with finding Citadels this league, and they do intend to change it, but I don't know what changes they're going to make, and so I think it's only fair that I throw my hat in the ring and say, as things stand now, this ain't it, although I am really pleased with many of the other changes that we've gotten so far. So, to summarize my thoughts here, I've been having a ton of fun at the league. I'm going to work on posting a full build guide for what I've got going on. If you guys are curious what the hell I was doing, it's pretty simple. I'm using Valiko's Vice to change my fire damage into lightning, and then just kind of using armor-piercing rounds to AoE clear. It actually became a much better AoE clear option than I was expecting, and using my explosive shots to kind of kill the rares and stuff, and use my explosive shot to debuff bosses and give them a higher shock, which I then kill using the shock burst rounds on my other weapon. So if you guys are interested in that, let me know. I'm going to be working on that in the next week or two. I probably want to try to level that on another character that's not a Deadeye. But yeah, this league has just gone super well for me. I've played a lot more than I expected to, and even downed all the pinnacle content and completed my Atlas. So that feels really good. So, like I said earlier in the video, I would kind of give Path of Exile 2 an 8 out of 10 right now. And the patch, I think, is about as good as you could possibly get. It still does have its own issues, and the patch I would give a 9 out of 10, especially with the 3.1 patch that we just got. I should say 0.3.1, but anyway. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for listening this long, and hopefully I'll catch you all on the next one. So until then, take care, stay safe. Last protagonist out.